Welcome back, or welcome to the Level One Coach Podcast. Drew and Mikael here. And we left off last episode kind of hinting at culture, belonging, belief, that sort of thing. And we're going to hop into belonging off the jump and we'll see where we end up. But this quote is from Owen Eastwood's book. It's called Belonging. If you haven't checked it out, I don't want to influence you, but I would recommend it. But check it out at your own free will. And the quote that we'll start off with, and I will kick it over to you, is belonging is a wildly undervalued condition required for human performance.
I had never heard of this quote till you just read it to me a couple minutes ago, but yeah, I love this because I think the undervalued piece is super interesting to me. I think I've always thought of it like when you're looking at, and I don't even think it's specific. I don't believe it's specific to any sport, but if you're looking at teams that are really good, so call them like definitely if you're talking pro sports, they're in the playoffs. They contend for championships on a yearly basis, but they don't get there quite or they fall short. And then you compare them to teams that are able to win championships or consistently win championships. Obviously, talent is involved, and I don't mean to undermine or undervalue the talent piece, but I really think that what separates, let's call them like great teams from excellent teams, or like almost championship level teams to championship level teams, is everyone says like culture, which is I think a way more broader term to use than just the belonging aspect that you're getting to. And I think when every player feels like they belong, like they're valued, like they're important, it allows them to reach their maximum potential. And that like I think the like compounding effects of that are so difficult to measure or difficult to like um figure out or quantify. That's what I'm looking for. They're so difficult to quantify because how do you like down to like your equipment manager or your the interns, like how do you know their impact versus if they weren't doing a good job, their lack of impact? And it's like when everyone feels like they belong and they're valued, there's such a everyone is doing such a good job at what they're being asked to do that you don't even realize, holy shit, we're so good at this, or everything's operating at the most optimized level until you leave and you see it not happen elsewhere. And so I think sometimes like people have a hard time putting into words like what makes, take hockey right now, like Florida Panthers, two Stanley Cups, like what makes them so good. It's probably very difficult if you're on that team or if you're like an everyday media member that sees them, like what is it? Is it that this guy's so good, this guy's so talented? Like you see some quotes about it, but like the culture or the belonging that that organization has from top all the way down to bottom is likely so much better than their counterparts that they can operate at a level that most teams can't even dream of achieving. And I think so. I think for me, like that belonging piece, I mean, outside of talent, it's probably paramount to anything else.
Yeah, I agree that I agree with the quote that it's undervalued, and I only think it's undervalued, and you were getting at this, um, because you can't see it and you can't measure it. But again, back to a couple episodes ago, you can feel it, and it's an energy. And Eastwood gets into it a little bit, and like it reminds me a lot of Power versus Force. He talks about just like the ancient knowledge and like we've tried to with analytics like part things out, and we've tried to like I don't like mean this in a negative way because I think as long as it's like the minute you measure something, like there's what is it? Goodhart's law. Like the minute you measure something, it fails to become like a good metric. So like we've talked about like the Shaka Smart high five thing. And like you can see high fives. But if you're broadcasting that, and I think we've talked about this a little bit, like then it fails to become like authentic, genuine, whatever. So like the whole like non-linear or like the energy aspect, you can't see love. You can't measure it on a chart. Um, you can't put it in an analytics package. But like when you feel it as like a player and like talk about the Panthers and whether it's the Panthers or Western Michigan just won in college hockey and you listen to guys talk after that. And it's not like it sounds cliche in the moment, but they're so like in awe or shocked that it happened that I think it's genuinely just true. But they say like this is the tightest team I've ever been on. And like the team that wins always ends up saying that. But I do think it's not in a press conference in December when you can think about it. It's like after you've won the biggest thing ever, and it's like 5 seconds after it happened. So like I think you're gonna get authentic human truth in that moment. So like there's something to be said when, you know, Barkov or Alex Bump from Western Michigan says like this is the closest team I've ever played with. Um, so yeah, I think the undervalued bit, just to reiterate, is because it's not measurable.
Yeah, the thing I come to right away, it's funny because obviously you're saying the same thing I was thinking of, like the quotes of like from I think it was from Barkov, like we usually have like 40 guys at a table for every meal that we've eaten this season or this playoff run. Like that doesn't that's not like breakout and power play. It's all that's just belonging. Like, and I think Paul Maurice had a quote earlier in the playoff series of like, um, when I go into the cafeteria or whatever, dining hall, whatever it's called, like there's different guys sitting with each other every day. So it's just like a constantly evolving mix of guys. There's not like these four and these five and these 10. They're all always sitting together. Like I think that gets in like group dynamics and like how different groups are able to be optimized based on how they interact. And I think the the undervalued thing, as you're getting at, with it's not measurable, and I think at the same time, we as people, and for sure within sports, we want to explain or provide rationale for phenomena. Like we just always, you turn on ESPN or you turn on, it doesn't even matter really. It's not specific. You just read an article. It's like, this team's expected goals versus this other team's expected goals. And it's a breakdown of how like Edmonton doesn't have this defenseman they should or this goalie they should. And like those things can all be true, but there's just no way to measure what the group cohesion was. So it's just not talked about. And I think it's not to say that these other elements don't factor in and or matter, because for sure, like having a goalie like Sergei Bobrovsky gonna help you out. The kid at Western Michigan, Slakinski or whatever, like gonna help you out. That obviously, if you don't have those guys, it's gonna be harder to win. So it's not to say that you can go take, whoever one of the worst teams in the NHL was and put them in front of Bobrovsky and you automatically win. Like it's not that, but there's there's an element I think that is like we just want to explain things, so we talk about the tangible, measurable, quantifiable elements, and it becomes all about that. And what people and you and I are part of these people on the outside that aren't involved in that organization don't see is like when Florida goes and signs like I don't even know how you say the guy's name, like Gadjevich or whatever from San Jose. I think it was San Jose, or like they go out and sign um I don't know. Verhaeghe's older now, or he's been there a while now, but someone like that, like on the surface, it might be like, why do you want to pay that guy X amount for his on ice? And I kind of get annoyed because you see like so many things around the trade deadline or now in the summer with like honestly, I can't even claim to know what it means, but there are like all these bar charts with like expected goals and like time on ice to this, and it's so advanced, and it's like that's a human. So he brings things outside of just those numbers and good and bad. Like it could work in his favor because he could be like an excellent leader or he could be an incredible role model for some of the younger guys as an older player now. And it could be in the negative that like he has these awesome numbers, but he's like a shit human or a shitty teammate, whatever it is. And I just feel like this is getting a little off topic, I guess, but I feel like there's so much talk of the quantifiable things because we just want to be able to explain why things occur. But like there's so much that's going on outside of the quantifiable elements that matter just as much, if not more. And we don't talk about those at all because from the outside, as a reader, as a viewer, as a writer, even, you don't know those things. You can't possibly be in the room and know like what Bill Zito and staff had to say when they learned about this Gadjevich guy. Like you just don't know. So you just look at what you know, which doesn't explain or paint the full picture.
Yeah, there's there's so much there's so much there.
Yeah, sorry, that was a lot.
No, you're good. Have you read Alchemy by Rory Sutherland?
Mm-mm.
No. Okay. So like Rory talks about this is thing like he's in the marketing world and he consults now and writes books and whatever. But like his thing when he speaks to any group, whether it's the airline industry or whatever, like we're so obsessed with the bar charts that you mentioned that you don't know what they mean, and neither do I. And like my my thing's always been, and I was just listening to see this is where the tism's gonna start going out of control for me. But I was just listening to Will Hardy um speak on a podcast, and he was talking about it has to be both. And like Hawkins says, power is holistic, force is analytic. And it has to be both. And Will Hardy's like, I don't want my assistants, and they don't do this. So I'm glad. But like, I don't want my assistants to be like, wow, like we really got beat up on the boards just by looking at the analytics. I want them to watch the game film back and then like either you can look at the stats first and then watch the game, or you can watch the game first and then look at the stats, but you have to do both because there could just be weird outliers that game where there were like 10 really long rebounds that just ended up where their guys were standing, and it can look like we got beat by a differential of 20 on rebounds, and we could be like, oh, that's the problem. We need to address that. Or if you watch the film back and you have the holistic perspective, like then you realize, wow, that was just like an outlier game. We can kind of throw that out. Like there were just rebounds going right to people longer than normal, just hitting the backboard or not the backboard. They don't use that anymore. Hitting the rim weird, um, and whatever. And like to circle all that back and tighten that up so we don't get on like hockey tactics or in-game stuff. Like the again, like you can tangibly look at the analytics and there's a number and it's nice and it's neat and it's pretty. And people think they can just do something with that. And it's foolish to look at someone as this amount of points is projected for next year, like that, like you said. And I laughed. Like that is a human being. And once you were dealing with group dynamics, which I love that you said that, and back to the beginning, that's Sutherland's whole thing. The minute that you inject humans into the equation, your mathematical model is it's useless because there's people with relationships, and every single day they're not your hockey players, regardless NHL or not. They're not robots. They don't come and just completely dissociate. They could have got in a fight with their spouse 5 minutes before they left. They could have, God forbid, lost a kid. Like, Um, Sorry to go morbid there. It just came to my mind, whatever reason. But like they could be having like contract disputes, talking to the front office, and then have to go put on a happy face for the coach. You just don't know unless you connect with these humans, which good coaches do, and ask questions and have coffee and chat and mix with new teammates and not create cliques and all that sort of stuff. But like if you're not prioritizing the human element over all the stuff that we can see, you're just, in my opinion, you're just not doing it right.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think the bar charts and the things I was mentioning and you're mentioning, I think they come from a good place
Sure.
of just wanting to be able to explain and make sense of why someone or some organization would do something. But a lot of times it it's just too hard to know. Um, because you don't have the full picture and not I guess I have like two separate things that come to mind. Like one was a couple summers ago, I wrote for a website. I don't want to say what it was, but it was a website that does a lot of like NHL and um, different hockey coverage. And essentially, you're like put on a team, and then you like a specific team, and then you write about things that are relevant. And it was summer, so like there obviously weren't like game recaps or anything to do. So it was like roster and trades and draft picks and stuff like that. And what I found, I stopped after about like 3 or 4 months. And what I didn't like about it, or what I found like uh, disingenuous, if that's a word, right? Yeah,
Yes, yes, it is.
is is that like I didn't know everything going on. So
Yeah.
when I'm looking at like XYZ trade and I'm trying to give this like breakdown of the trade, it was fun because it forced me to like I usually don't look that much into like NHL trades and draft picks and what does that pick from 2020 turn out being 5 years later. Um, but as I was doing it, so that part was interesting. But as I was doing it, I was like, I don't remember, take X trade, whatever trade it was. And it's like, a 31-year-old NHL veteran for a second round pick that upcoming draft. Like, the outlets essentially, not that this outlet wanted this, but the let's say the status quo thing to do would be to say rank this trade. Is it an A, an A minus, a B, a C? And I remember just thinking like, how the hell am I supposed to give an accurate ranking of this when like you don't even know who that second round pick might end up being?
Mhm.
And and even if it's a sixth round pick, like that sixth round pick could be Zetterberg or Datsuk or whichever of those two was drafted super late. Like that could be a Hall of Famer that team ends up taking. And right now it's an unknown. So it looks like they just gave up a 31-year-old vet for some kid who might never play in the NHL, but he also might be a stud. And so it's like with those types of things, it just gets back to me of like you don't know the belonging aspect, and you don't know whether the guy that was traded for or traded out was a great or will be a great fit or was not a great fit in the room before. And then you don't know who's coming in if it's a draft pick in this scenario, or even if it's another player. Was he not a great fit? Will he be a great fit for you? And that kind of segues into the other thing that comes to mind for me is like the transfer portal stuff. We've talked about that before on prior episodes, and like a lot of these moves, I'll be the first to say, like on the surface, I'm like, what is going on? Like a guy's been at 3 schools in 3 years, or he's played at, let's say, two really good programs. Or sorry, like he's been at one really good program as a freshman. He had a pretty good year, and now he's moving to a second program. That's for all intents and purposes, equal. They're both very good. And a lot of times I'll just be like my like gut reaction, or for sure I find a lot of the gut reaction of like, analysts and opinion people on social media are like, why would he do this? This is ridiculous, whatever. This is indicative of college sports being like pro. And those things may all be true. I'm not saying they're not. But no one knows how that kid felt in that room or how much he did or didn't belong. And he's choosing to go from X school to Y school. And maybe at X school, like he just flat out wasn't a fit. Yeah, he had a good year on the ice. Maybe he got along great with the coaches, but for whatever reason, whether it was like where the program's based, maybe he's a California kid that's playing in a market that's so, or at a school that's so unlike where he grew up that like, just off the top of my head, like ASU is a better fit for him. And so it's just like culturally, like people, everything, this is just where I want to be. And it could be the opposite too of like you just don't feel like, or not the opposite. It could be the same in the sense like you just don't feel like where you were was a good fit for you as a person, and it has a lot less to do with like the coach, the coaches and the hockey and even your teammates. So I've never really thought about it from this lens before, but I even think sometimes with the transfer portal, like it's given players obviously the ability, the autonomy to be more of like a pro athlete in charge of their own future. And with that comes like, I mean, I just remember being a Columbus fan, like Panarin and Bobrovsky, no interest in re-signing in Columbus. One goes to Miami, one goes to New York City. Pretty fun places to live. If you're ranking cities in the US, they're above Columbus. So like that had nothing to do, in theory, it had nothing to do with like organization, coach, teammates in Columbus. That's why is that not also true of college hockey, where to stick with that example, you're from a kid from California, you're used to the warm weather, you're in like, I don't know, somewhere in the Northeast, or you're in like Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin area, it snows every day, and you're just like, this is so not for me. I can go play at ASU and pretty much get the same experience that I did every day growing up in California. Like I'm doing that. That has nothing to do with the hockey and the tactics and all that and skill set or lack of. That's belonging and where you feel like you fit in. So yeah, that was another thing for me that just popped in my head as we're talking about this.
Yeah. I think me and you have talked about this part off the air. Um, I think it was you. But anyway, like we've been talking about transfer portal and stuff like that, and just like the changing landscape, and some coaches are just retiring early, don't want to deal with it, whatever. And I think like again, this is a Sutherland thing. Like we have to think, are we asking the wrong question? And I think a lot of times we're saying like we're blaming the kids, like you were talking about, like selfishness and like look what we've done to college sports and like all the questions that you formulate around that are fine, whatever. But like the question that I asked you that I think some of the smartest coaches in college hockey are now asking, and it deals with belonging. How do we make this environment so good, user experience perspective? Like, how do we make this environment so good that people don't want to leave? And if you can attack it from that angle, then you're going to put belonging and culture at the center and first, a priori. Um, and then like if a kid wants to leave, we were talking about this off air, then like it's not you. And like it could be them. And they could just want to leave because they don't fit or it's the weather or whatever. But like if you're creating conditions that like you're going to make players better on the ice, you're going to provide a player development experience, you're going to provide um an energy that people want to be around from coaching staff, team support staff, everyone's a good person. Um, like if you start to attack it from belonging first, then like if a kid wants to leave, you can cross that off as like I definitely didn't. It definitely wasn't that. Um, if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, you remove a variable that right now you can't. well, I shouldn't say you can't. Depending on where you are and what you're doing, you may not be able to. So if you don't have like the best player development environment that you could, or you're not necessarily like filtering for what you offer in the players you recruit. So you're essentially neglecting maybe some of the human elements of the recruiting piece, and you're just looking at the player specifically and like what can they bring me on the ice versus like what do they want and what aligns with their values and desires. Like then after a year, 2 years, you might have frequent turnover because you haven't necessarily like found people that are going to fit what you have to offer. Um, Whereas if you are filtering for that in the recruiting process, you're probably going to bring in people that are more aligned with what you have to offer in the first place. And then if there's a mismatch, which there always and look, you can do all that and still have a player want to transfer. Like it's not to say that it's like foolproof thing,
Um,
but if you're doing that and you're also losing players or having players leave, then it's due to something different than them not knowing that what they were getting or what they were advertised is not what they were going to get. And I think the reality for college sports at large, it does is really outside of hockey, every sport include or not, sorry, hockey's included, but not just specific to hockey, is that for the longest time, like if you are, you know, um, Georgia football, like you pretty much you can do whatever you want. Like you get kids to come there and you have a lot to offer, and then once they're there, they're yours. And the barriers, I think we may have talked about this already before, but the barriers to leave are so high that no one does. And so as a result, if what you sold versus what you got, or if what you were selling versus what they were going to get was different, there was less accountability. And now there's just like such a high level of accountability with like if you go to a place, so stick with that example of Georgia football, if you go there and what you thought it was going to be is not what it is, you're gone the next day. Not literally, but proverbially you are. And I think that part is where coaches across all sports in college, like you have to kind of adapt right now and make sure that like the elements that are important to players today are being taken care of and thought about from a player development perspective so that you're not constantly at the mercy of everyone leaving every year because what they thought they were going to get is not what they're getting. And I think that, yeah, I remember one college hockey coach a couple of years ago, like 5 years ago now during COVID. I mean, his team has won multiple championships in the conference and competing in the NCAA tournament. And like his comment was just like, this transfer portal stuff is what it is. None of us are going to change it. And we all have to adapt immediately if we want to survive. And it's cool to reflect back on now thinking about that because his team is at some was at some serious disadvantages and he found a way to still have a lot of success throughout the transfer portal transition. And a lot of that to me gets into like belonging and how his players felt, what his players got versus what they thought they were going to get. It's probably very much aligned. And now guys come there feeling valued, feeling like they belong, and they want to stay. Even though there may be like sexier, better options out there, they want to be where they're at. That like there's no stat for that, and there's no analytic to dive into with that. It's a people thing, it's a feel thing. But it to me it matters, like I said before, just as much, if not more, than some of the other quantifiable elements.
yeah, I think there's a physics analogy somewhere in there, and I'll try and while I'm talking sort that out in my brain. But before I get there, uh, I just wrote something down, a nice little simple chart, but it was just integrity and then an arrow to the right, and then trust decreases if there's not integrity, and then they feel like they don't belong. So like where I'm going with all that, and I'll make sense of my weird note, is like the coaches that have, excuse me, the coaches that have seen themselves out of the game, early retirements, don't want to deal with this stuff, whatever. Um, they were probably, and the reason they quickly kind of got found out and then retired, and this is me just pontificating. This, I don't have the context, but there's a plausible explanation that I'm going to use, accurate or not. That is, they were selling what they couldn't provide, what you were getting at. And if you're leading with that, and then the point that I'm getting to is if you're leading with non-integrity in your recruiting, the player's trust in you is immediately going to go out the window. And then to bring in my physics analogy, like your bond is not going to be very tight. You're going to have it's instead of like ice version of H2O where everything's stuck together and nothing's moving, like that's good culture. That's good cohesion. You're going to have the gaseous state of water where they're just going, and you've seen it in your elementary or middle school videos where like those things are just bouncing around loosely everywhere and they're going to escape. So like and then we blame the kids on top of all that and be like, you're selfish. This is what we've created. It's like, well, was he lied to from literally the jump? And like, would you then not want to jump ship, pun intended, um, if that stuff's going on? So, that's where my mind goes right away.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I think of it like your with your example of kind of like the trust and the integrity, like to me, it's like your credibility. Now, you were told X, it didn't happen the way you were told. So now that coach or person's credibility has gone down. And the next time they tell you something, you second guess. And this
Mm.
is like we can say this is specific to the player coach relationship, but it's not. It's any human. Like if I tell you that I'm gonna do something in a certain way and then I go about a totally different way of doing it, the next time I tell you I'm gonna do something a certain way, you're gonna question whether I really am or not. And I think that part is where like we've known this as a society or as like a sporting industry. We've known this in professional sports. We see it all the time. Like, some player signs a massive deal and 2 years into it, they don't feel like they're getting what they deserved or what they signed up for. And so they look to be traded. And 9 times out of 10, they are traded. And a lot of times I feel like those guys end up, this is totally anecdotal. I don't have evidence to back it up, but I feel like those guys end up going to other teams and doing really well. So like that to me speaks to the belonging and the environment that they were in and not being able to perform to their best. Now they go somewhere else, they reach their max potential. And I think, I guess bringing it back to what we're saying with the college game, like across all sports, you've known this in professional realm. We all see it. We're just now starting to see it occur in college, and some of us are still surprised by it. And it's like, but why? Why are you surprised? Like you've known that this is the reality for professional sports. It is now no different. And I know there's money involved, and especially with like high profile football, basketball, it's like insane money, money that is essentially more lucrative than professional sports. But these principles, they're analogous from pro to college, and it's happening in the college game now. And I really like it. I think it's an interesting time for all of this. Speaking of belonging and culture, like it's an interesting time to be looking at this stuff because a lot of it is so like fast. It's ever changing and it's so fluid. Like something that was a huge deal 4 years ago is now so common, we've forgotten it ever wasn't that way. So I think of like what will happen in 4 years from now that we can't imagine today. But I think in like 25, 30 years, looking back on this specific time in college athletics, I think it'll be interesting to examine who won, why, and what allowed them to be more successful than others. Because I'm thinking of like the College World Series, like I think it was like McNeese State or something. Horrendous facilities. I'd imagine they don't have money to pay NIL play or NIL money to pay their players like an LSU or even like a Coastal Carolina that's always a really good baseball program. But they're able to get to the end anyway. Um, I got to think that's due to the belonging element, the environment, how the players feel going there and their desire to stay in that environment, even though they may know there's better alternatives out there. Um, so I just think like, there's not enough evidence today and there's the timeline's too short, but 25, 30 years from now, looking back on this, call it from like 2020 on, this little era of college athletics, like it'll be interesting to see who, like I said, who won and what were those reasons past like maybe some sports, it was literally just the ability to provide insane money. And that could be as simple as that. But there's levels within that because there's a lot of teams. There may not be 200 football teams, but there's 30 that can pay that kind of money or 10. Only one wins. Why? What are they doing that was different? What did they do that separated themselves? So, yeah, I think that that whole like element of it's interesting to me, I guess, circling back of like we've known this exists. We've known that pro sports operate under this kind of like pretense of like you got to follow through on what you say you're going to do. We're just sort of finding out that like this now also applies in college.
Yeah, I want to respect your time constraints, so I'll just end with this. Promise I won't go long, but this is part of a tweet from Julie Gurnier that I just saw on Twitter this morning. Um, and it deals with like a Sam Hinkie thing that I'll get into, and then I'll shut up. The top players are rarely separated by skill; they are separated how they mentally approach the game. So, like Hinkie talks about, um, in the NBA, the NHL, salary cap leagues, you can only spend a certain amount, and all the players, with the exception of your Connor McDavid's, are in like a pretty tight window of they're the best and they play in that league because their skill is within a range to play in that league. So like the skill window is tight. The salary cap dollars are within a very tight range that you can spend and you can't exceed it. Um, Everyone has access to all this analytics stuff. Everyone has access to this, that, and the next thing. They all have awesome facilities in the NBA, I think in 2025. I think they've all gotten there. So like then what? And like to circle all the way back to the initial quote, belonging is undervalued, but like belonging is the separator. So I'll leave you with that. Drop a comment, join the conversation, whatever you want to do, and we'll catch you on the next one.